Leonette is here, so we can now open the meeting. We have 40 people here. Thank you, from all over the state. Leonette, I already mentioned our January meeting. So
thank you, Dana. A little technical Zoom glitch on my end, but here I am. And at first, I'd like to welcome all of our attendees from around the state and to thank you for some of the thoughtful questions that you have already submitted to the League for us to discuss tonight. And before we get into that meaty discussion, I have just a couple of local announcements. First, our Giving Tuesday campaign has really blown me away, and we will continue that through the end of the month. The donor has agreed to up her match because we have surpassed her original goal. So we have until the end of December to give to the League Ed Fund, and you can do in memory or in honor. And we have nice cards that we will send to the appropriate people. Also, I'd like to mention that in keeping with our environmental programs that Dana is arranging for early in the new year, we are exploring some outdoor activities that will meet CDC guidelines. And we have abundant local and accessible trail systems. So we're already working on that. That will be in addition to the January and February programs, but it will bring some of the challenges into greater understanding, and we want to have some experts with us to along the way. And I think it'll be a little bit of fun in our social schedule as well. So that being said, I'm going to turn the program over to Dana so that she can introduce to our guest speakers and talk about our program tonight. Thank you, Dana.
Welcome everybody again. It's so nice to see everyone. I think everybody has themselves muted, but if you don't, please do that. We are being recorded. Just wanted to let people know that. Our meeting tonight is we're going to have an opportunity to learn about voting rights initiatives that the League presented to Alabama Arise for consideration for priorities this year. And the membership of Arise voted. So this is part of their priorities. We have two speakers, Barbara Caddell and Dev Wakeley, and my understanding is that Barbara's going to go first, so I will introduce her first. For those of you who are League members, she probably needs no introduction. She's in her second term as the State League chair right now, and she's been a member of the League since 1976. Well, I was trying to read, I'm having trouble reading. Okay. Her first League job was compiling information for the Capitol newsletter, which was the name of the newsletter at that time. And the League's broad spectrum of issues for action appealed to her. She has worked in such diverse policy areas as the environment and climate change, social justice, transparency in government, and money in politics. As this is the centennial year for women's suffrage, and she's participated in efforts to highlight the activities of Alabama suffragists to ensure that Alabamians and Alabama sites are celebrated on the National Votes for Women Trail. In keeping with her involvement with suffrage issues, she's committed to expanding voting rights. She's proud that the LWVAL is collaborating with nonpartisan organizations like the Campaign Legal Center to assist citizens with felony convictions to restore their right to vote. During the upcoming legislative session, the League will be advocating for other voting rights reforms, such as making absentee voting less confusing and allowing curbside and early voting. So with no further ado, I'm going to turn the meeting over to Barbara.
Well, thank you. Thank you one and all for both for coming and for doing all of the work necessary to get your less than adept president looking like she's wearing shoes. Tonight, go ahead and show the first slide. Tonight, Deb and I are going to be talking about voting rights advocacy in Alabama. And of course, everybody here knows that the League's been around for 100 years and we were all up in voting. We participated in 2 lawsuits this year. One that we filed in state court where we were the lead plaintiff, and the other we participated as a friend of the court. And
We've lost her. We've lost Barbara, I hope
no,
temporarily.
you haven't lost me. You can't get rid of me that easily.
All right, carry on.
Anyway, I wanted to say that Deb and I are both going to be talking about voting rights. I'm presuming everybody heard that part of it. And I'm going to lay the foundation with just the issues and the league's position. And Deb is going to get down in the weeds with y'all and talk specifically about what we can do together, how we can work together, and how we can make Alabama a better place to live. Next slide, please.
Yeah.
There we go. There's 3 basic areas that the league is working on in terms of voting rights advocacy. And when I say advocacy, right now we're going to be talking about legislative advocacy, working on either opposing or supporting specific legislation. But advocacy is a whole lot more than that. It encompasses not only working on specific bills, but working with policymakers to perhaps change some things administratively that don't require a law. That also involves educating both the administrators themselves and our citizens on various aspects of voting rights. So it's a broad spectrum. I'm really proud of my voting rights champions in Alabama. But the first topic that we look at is voting rights restoration for people who have lost their right to vote because they have committed a disqualifying felony. The second is universal automatic voter registration, which is pretty self-explanatory. And the last is absentee and early voting reforms so that it is safer and easier to vote in Alabama. Next slide. Last month, you had a wonderful presentation from Kathy Jones about voting rights restoration. I'm not going to belabor that point with you, except to sort of outline some of the things that the league supports in this process. We would like to require that all people with felony convictions be notified of their voting rights. The vast majority of people who commit felonies and are convicted of felonies can vote because they don't fall into the disqualifying felony category. So it's important that people be notified of their voting status. We also would like to add to the list of disqualifying felonies some white-collar crimes like ethics violations. It really is interesting that people who commit ethics violations can vote, but people who steal things cannot. So we'd like to equalize the things that remove your voting rights. We also we are working with legislators to advocate for bills that would remove the application process to get your voting rights back, to have an automatic way that when you have served your time and you have completed your sentence, you are automatically registered to vote. And part of the problem with all of this, of course, is that many of the people who deal with citizens with felony convictions don't understand the process. So we'd like to mandate some extra training for them. And finally, we'd like to require that the Secretary of State put this kind of information on his website, along with the voter registration application, to outline for all of us what happens when you have a felony conviction. Next slide. Another advocacy item for us is universal automatic voter registration. As you know, in Alabama, we have an opt-in process of voter registration. We'd like to change that to an opt-out so that every public agency will, excuse me, share your basic information. And when your information when you change your information, it automatically is changed in the voter registration website. On the voter registration list. Why is this important? Well, because voting is a habit. And we know that young people need to register to vote and get in the habit of voting. So when they have kids, when life intervenes, they still go ahead and vote. Well, if we can register everybody when they turn 18, then we have a way of keeping track of them and also of encouraging them to vote. Also, natural disasters and pandemics, as we all know, have wreaked havoc on the way that we normally do voter registrations. So if it were automatic, we wouldn't have to sit outside in the rain under a tent for people to drive up and for us to hand them voter registration information. Also, that the pandemic and various natural disasters have kept us out of schools because they're focused on other things rather than voting, registering their students to vote. So if we had an automatic system, we wouldn't be doing all of those things. Last, but certainly not least, is the fact that many populations change addresses frequently and don't update their voter registration. Well, if the Secretary of State purges the voter lists regularly, and if you don't vote and if you don't respond to his postcards, he takes you off the list. So if the list was updated automatically every time you moved, every time I am so sorry. My internet connection is unstable. Next slide, please. The last set of items that we're going to advocate for, we're calling it doing it our way, because it gives voters some choice in how they vote. Everybody that voted absentee knows how difficult that process is. We would like to see some tweaks to the absentee voting system. One of which is a way to institute no excuse absentee voting. 34 states have no excuse absentee voting, and several more have only voting by mail. Now, the league doesn't support only one way of voting. What we'd like to support is having the choice and not having to have a note from your mother if you need to be able to register, if you want to vote by mail. So we support no excuse absentee voting. We support the removal of the witness or the notarized signatures on the ballot application. And we would also support the modification of the time limits for voting. There was a lot of confusion this year because there is one date that's the deadline for you to mail your ballot and another date that it must be received by. And if you mailed it by the deadline, unless there was a miracle, it would not be received by deadline. So we need to get that straight. But more than that, it would be nice for the election officials to begin counting as soon as the ballots received, so that on election night, they are not sitting in a room piled to the ceiling with absentee ballots that need to be counted. Now, one other item here under doing it our way is early voting. Early voting, again, allows people to choose. And I was unaware until we got involved with this lawsuit that even though an employer is required to allow you to take time off work in order to vote, you only have an hour. So if you have to travel from your job to a polling place that's crowded, you may be less inclined to vote than if you could pick your time a little more expeditiously. So we feel that early voting will reduce lines. It will be, it will promote voting, and it will also can come in handy in times of pandemic, so that so many people are not just crowded together in a voting place. One item that I did not mention because I couldn't figure out how to get it on the slide is curbside voting. In many places, people have tried curbside voting until the Secretary of State forbade it this year. I didn't quite understand how he could do that, but he did. And it seems to me that particularly for our citizens with disabilities or people who have very serious health concerns, it's helpful to be able to drive up to the polling place just like you drive through the bank. So we would support these things. Next slide, please. Now, underlying all this concern with voting rights, two items that are integrally connected to voting rights, even though they are not specific voting rights. One is governmental transparency. And I know that Deb is going to talk some more about that, as well as about fear maps. But governmental transparency is essential if we're going to have a free and fair electoral process. Right now, we do have an Open Records Act, but it lacks a lot of things. It does not have a specific response period. So it says you have the right to see some government documents, but it doesn't say anything about how quickly you should be able to get them. There's no enforcement mechanism, so you can require it, and your application can go in file 13 and nobody knows. There's no fee schedule. It says that the agencies should charge a fair price, but nobody knows how much that is. And also, there's no reason data be collected in any kind of reasonable way for organizations or private citizens to get this information. So there's a lot of problems with that. And there was an Open Records Act bill last session that died when COVID came along. And we are hopeful this time around that we can begin to make some baby steps in that direction. The other issue that affects voting rights is, of course, redistricting. And Deb has something that's going to be very interesting to share with you about gerrymandering and how we need to be able to draw maps fairly so that the legislature looks like the population of Alabama, as opposed to the law school class from the University of Alabama when my husband graduated. So those issues are underlying all of our work in voting rights. Now, last slide, please. People say all the time, what can we do? Well, guess what? I have some suggestions. Number one is to join our advocacy team. Robin Buckaloo and Kathy Jones, whose email addresses are at the bottom of this slide, are heading up the League's advocacy effort. They are doing, I'm very excited about the work that they're doing. They have somebody that's going to write a blog. They're talking about getting together an observer corps, and also, of course, a campaign of letter writing. So contact Robin or Kathy and tell them what you're interested in doing. I put observe committee meetings because we are trying to get a statewide observer corps, particularly with an eye to the redistricting part of things. Because that the legislative in Alabama, as you know, the districts are drawn by the legislature. So we need to have our eyes open and our pens ready to write letters when they start drawing maps. So we need people to observe. Also, I'm encouraging every local league to meet with their local legislative delegation in some format. With the advent of Zoom, it's easier than it could be. So I encourage you to do that, to get to know them. In Mobile, we used to have a party and invite them and get to know them so that when we contact them, we're not stark strangers. You will be getting some calls to action when bills come up that we need help with. And Alabama Arise, you can go on their website and sign up for their alerts. And their alerts are can be targeted so that everybody who is in a particular senator's district can get the same email and all write to him. Then, of course, last but not least, follow us on social media, because we're going to be putting out information on social media. So I'm hoping I haven't run too far over time, but thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about one of my favorite things, which is voting and how we can make it better in Alabama. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Barbara. And folks, I'm going to hold the questions till the end. I'm monitoring the chat box and we will get to them. Next, I want to introduce Dev Wakeley. Dev joined Alabama Rise as a policy analyst in 2018. His work covers numerous consumer and human rights issues, including payday and title lending reform, public transportation, and criminal justice policies. He's a Gardendale native who has a BA in philosophy from Franklin and Marshall College. That's why you're so smart. And a JD from the University of Alabama. He was admitted to the bar in 2017. During law school, he served on the Public Interest Student Board Executive Committee and the Alabama Civil Rights and Civil Liberties Law Review. He also worked on the Elder Law Clinic through the UA School of Law and the Clemency Project for the Federal Defenders Program for the Middle District of Alabama. So I'm now going to turn it over to Dev Wakeley from Alabama Rise.
Hey everybody, glad to be here tonight. Thanks so much for having me. I want to dive into some of the particulars of some of the issues that we're going to be working on this year. Primarily, our focus is going to be on voter rights restoration and automatic universal voter registration. There is one particular aspect that's unique to this upcoming legislative session, and that's going to be redistricting. That must be done this year, and it's actually going to be really important, not just for fairness purposes overall, even though we like to see a fair game, but particularly the legislature has a history of gamesmanship in redistricting in particular areas, even where they wouldn't already have a partisan supermajority for one party. It's really egregious, and I'm actually going to show you a little bit of the map about how it's accomplished. pretty much what happens is the now Republican supermajority in the legislature draws certain districts just barely into Jefferson County with very little population, specifically over in the western area of the county. Don't know if we've got anybody from, say, West Jefferson up here tonight, but probably not, because there's hardly anybody there, right? It's not very highly populated. But they draw House District 16 in to Jefferson County just enough to get Cal South on the Jefferson County delegations committee, and therefore to maintain a partisan majority that is not reflective of the population generally. And while this is done for partisan purposes primarily, it has the clear effect of stripping Democratic power from Black legislators in Jefferson County who would otherwise maintain a majority in the Jefferson County delegation. So it's done for partisan purposes, and it is really, really clearly racist in effect. And I'll pull that up and show you exactly how it's done in a little bit here. That's going to be a particularly important issue right now, because the redistricting must be done in the legislative session directly after the census completes and gives its numbers to allow redistricting to occur. As for automatic universal voter registration, I want to talk a little bit about that and let you know, first off, that we have this year a highly motivated bill sponsor, as we did last year. Same representative is going to carry this bill, Prince Chestnut out of Selma. He has not introduced it yet, but that may be a good thing in light of the fact that every single elections bill we have has gone into the House Constitution Campaigns and Elections Committee, which is pretty much one of the worst committees we've got for us in terms of progress in legislation. And that committee, I'm going to drop the committee webpage into the chat here so that y'all can know whether your representative is on this committee. And if your representative is on this committee, especially please sign up for our legislative alerts, because we would like to bring a lot of pressure to bear when these voting rights bills come up in CC&E. On the Senate side, with automatic voter registration, we haven't really gotten there, and I don't know what it's going to look like when we do. But the Senate has been better in our other major priority issue, which is voter rights restoration. Unfortunately, the makeup of the Senate committee that carried that voter rights restoration bill last year has changed. Senator Cam Ward is now Commissioner Cam Ward of the Bureau of Pardons and Paroles. And while this means that maybe somebody who deserves parole and ought to be out and wants to participate in Alabama society will have the chance to now that Graddick's gone, it doesn't bode quite as well for the Senate Judiciary Committee. Ward was conscientious and would listen to us when we'd go asking things, and we don't know what that's going to look like right now. Last year, the restoration bill that Senator Linda Coleman Madison sponsored moved very well in that committee, and Ward gave it a lot of air, a lot of room to breathe, and worked to bring it forward. So that could be a bit more of a stumbling block this year than it has been in the past. On the House side for rights restoration, we have Representative Laura Hall sponsoring that bill, as she did last year. Now, last year we had a bit of an issue as well because we had two separate and slightly competing versions of those bills, one of which the difference in them was that one of them counted restitution as something that would not that would not block someone from getting their rights restored, and the other did not. Those are relatively minor differences in the grand scheme. There are lots of policy reasons to talk about the differences between restitution and what actual victims' restitution looks like, and whether that should allow folks to get their rights back sooner or not. But not all restitution is restitution. I'll start off by saying that. Much restitution, much financial obligation is classified as restitution, even though it doesn't directly go to the victims of crime. And that doesn't have any effect on how politically difficult to get restitution taken off of a bill to restore rights would be, because people are still going to see, well, they don't want people to make restitution, and therefore I'm going to oppose this. It's a complicated issue, and there are policy reasons to support both areas. But one thing that we have been trying to do this year, leading up to this coming session, is to make sure that we're kind of all on the same page, or at least ready to get on the same page if one of these versions of the bill moves and one doesn't. Representative Hall has been, as usual, a clear-eyed, pragmatic advocate for voter rights, and has said that, you know, if it moves with restoration, that's great. If it moves without restoration, that's still great. Anything we can do to get more people reenfranchised is a step forward for Alabama. So I'm going to bring up now, actually, I think I have one more drop in here. I do want to talk about how important it is to keep an eye on your boards of registrars and the Secretary of State's operations overall. And one way to do that is by looking at the Open Meetings Act notices on the Secretary of State's website. I just dropped that link in the chat. Please bookmark that. These meetings must be advertised ahead of time, and they must be open to the public. Today, actually, there was a meeting of the advisory board of the Secretary of State. I couldn't make it. I had a pre-existing commitment, but they're actually surprisingly happy to see everybody come in, usually speaking. Didn't have any opposition, and very, very little public participation in the last couple I've seen, pre-COVID, of course. But the registrars show up, and they are happy to have folks come in and discuss things with them. And when you can build those sorts of relationships with registrars from across the state, then it makes it easier to go to them in the off season and have them take your concerns seriously. And it also allows you to know what they're really thinking when officials who are a little higher up on the food chain might say there are things that are feasible or not feasible. And you can then respond to elected officials who are grandstanding or fundamentally hostile to expansions of voting rights when you know a little more that's on the ground and you've talked to the registrars. I don't know how much back and forth y'all have with your local registrars, or registrar in the case of Jefferson, but they are certainly happy to hear from you, and that's a good way in the chat there to get to know them and to know what they're thinking. Now I'm going to see if I can pull this up to share my screen and show you just how badly some of these gerrymandered districts look like. Let's see. All right. All right. Can y'all see this? Yeah, great.
Yes.
This is House District 16 right here. It starts in Lamar and Fayette counties and covers a lot of the population of those and goes all the way neatly over here into Jefferson County, where it tucks into West Jefferson. And the very sparsely populated areas. And that is important because it helps to give a chokehold on this committee. Let's see if I can pull that up in a second. On the Jefferson County Delegation Committee and the legislature overall. So right here we have an extremely rural, sorry, I didn't mean to stop. So right here we have an extremely rural area of the state in Jefferson County. This is the Warrior River, and right next to it, there's pretty much nothing. And if you scroll over here, you can see your state elected officials and your representatives. So there's pretty much no one who lives there. It's a very sparsely populated area. West Jefferson has just a couple of thousand people, if that. They may not even have 2,000. But it is drawn in for the purpose of bringing Representative South into the Jefferson County Legislative Delegation meeting. And therefore diluting African American representation in that committee. Now, this coming session, assuming that the census is completed when it's supposed to be, which we don't really know for sure if that's going to actually happen. I think in some form it will be. The legislature is required to redistrict. When that comes up, well, oh, I see in the chat there, I say that district is sparsely populated. What I mean is that the portion of it that is in Jefferson County is sparsely populated. It's just enough, it's just drawn over there so that the folks in Jefferson County don't really have much of an impact in South's district, but it still gets him onto that committee. So, I mean, it's a sparsely populated area that actually allows him to be part of the Jefferson County delegation. And if you're talking about folks who vote and live in, you know, Vernon, they're not going to have the same policy needs as somebody who lives in West Jefferson anyway. While it's a little bit more rural, it's basically, you know, 10 miles from massively urbanized Birmingham. It's done specifically to skew the representation on that committee and to prevent African Americans from running it as they would if it were a democratically, if it were a proportionately representative committee. So this year, redistricting will occur, and we want the committee to we want the legislature to redistrict in a democratically fair and representative way. We don't want legislative gamesmanship, and when it comes down to it, we'd prefer to have that done as the maps are drawn instead of through lawsuits after the fact. While the state of Alabama has been, unfortunately, happy to go into court and allow some of the legislators to make hay politically off of losing lawsuits again and again. I think I saw Dylan here, and while I love the ACLU, I would prefer that you know, the state of Alabama didn't consistently happily lose $1 million judgments for lawyers' fees for indefensible actions. And I think that legislative pressure is incredibly important in just allowing and just making sure that these folks who are running things know that we see what they're doing and that we don't approve of legislative gamesmanship that diminishes democracy and has overtly racist effects. That's going to be a unique situation in this session. And I'm going to be honest with you, I don't know exactly what it's going to look like in terms of pressure on the redistricting committee. Don't know what access to them is going to look like. And this is something we've been kind of scratching our heads about for a little while now, because we really don't know what the session is going to look like. Unfortunately, we don't know to what extent legislators are going to be available for public participation in the building itself. So that's going to make our action alerts even more important. If you can go sign up for those, we will provide you access to the legislators through their phone numbers. All you'll have to do is send them emails or click through to send an email, or click through to allow us to call them on your phone. We will make it easy for you, but we don't know if our normal avenues of pressure are going to be quite as prevalent as they have been in the past, unfortunately. We're not going to, I think that the odds of me stalking the halls of the State House and David, our legislative director, doing the same are not going to be very high. I think there's going to be significant restriction because I don't think we can get COVID under control that fast. So there are going to be some changes from the normal affairs. So please sign up for those legislative alerts, and we will help put pressure on folks to, advance voter rights restoration, to allow automatic voter registration, which really, would save the state so much money, over $1 million a year, if all registrations were conducted automatically versus paper, and to bring about a fair redistricting process that doesn't play on gamesmanship or seek to entrench partisan advantage. And that's pretty much what I've got. I would love to hear any questions that you have, or I guess I'll hand it back over to Dana and let her talk
Right.
about.
Thank you so much, Deb. There were some questions that Tara Bailey sent ahead of time, and I see that you're on the call. I'm going to read the questions, but obviously, if you want to expand some, you can unmute yourself. Her first question was about Saturday voting. So in this last election, John Merrill said that nothing prohibited Saturday voting in terms of the absentee voting in person, although some counties chose not to do that. And according to Tara's note, apparently Madison County specifically said it was against the law. How do we ensure that Saturday voting is approved and offered in all counties in Alabama?
The most comprehensive fix for that would be a legislative one.
I was going to say a law. That'll be a law.
Yeah, just pass a bill for it. That's an issue of prioritization and whether or not we can actually get these bills moving in the first place. It's really a strategy decision. I certainly understand how Saturday voting would help a lot more voters get out and do their voting on their own terms. And in terms of the Madison County folks saying, well, we can't do this, it's illegal, just some education on that matter would probably help them out, because they ought to know better, but if they don't, well, have to educate them about it.
And there's nothing like a lot of public pressure. We did not win our lawsuit, but every time we talked about the lawsuit, the Secretary of State nudged a little closer and made a little baby step. So there's nothing to discount the utility of public pressure on this.
That's one of the things I was going to suggest. I know in Jefferson County, what caused us to be able to have Saturday absentee voting in person was public pressure on the county commission. the absentee election managers can do it whenever they want. The commission has to open the building. So second question was, what are your thoughts on the current early voting bill that I believe makes early voting available up to 5 days prior to the election? Do you think approval of this would have any effect on the early in-person absentee voting being available 55 days prior to the election?
Well, I'm not aware of any current pre-filed bills. I know there was one last year, but I'm not aware of any that are currently filed.
This is Tara. I've been following a lot of articles and things like news articles. I think John Rogers is planning on and reintroducing a bill for early voting. So he may not have done it quite yet, but it is in the works. And in his delivery, I think I was listening to the Alabama Forward conference that they just had recently. And he said that the early voting would be up to 5 days prior to the election starting, but it would actually be up to each county to decide maybe if they only wanted to do 2 of the 5 days or 3 of the 5. Like it's still kind of up to them of like how many days they really want to do, but they could start it up to 5 days prior to the election starting. So I thought it was just interesting to talk about tonight. So
I'm going to go to your third question then, is that getting no excuse absentee voting and early voting passed will take the public contacting their legislators to request that they support those efforts. What is the plan to let people know? And the second part of that, that they need to contact their representatives. And then the next question, will COVID affect how we can effectively reach our representatives? And again, Deb kind of commented on that at the end of his meetings, but do we, I would assume in part, the League of Women Voters Action Alerts and the Alabama Arise Action Alerts, if people will sign up for those and pay attention, then that's going to kind of help us know what we need to do. Dev or Barbara, do you have other thoughts?
Sure. Even on elements of voter rights advancement that aren't specifically part of our issue priority this year, we're still going to send out action alerts on those. We absolutely will. We'll send targeted to members of the committee, and once bills get out of committee, also to members of whatever house is going to be voting on it.
And Dev had posted his link for how to sign up for those. I reposted it again just a few minutes ago so that people have that.
Yeah,
And then
I was just going to say, well, I'm envious of Deb's capability to target the action alerts only to a certain segment. We're working on it, but we're not there yet.
Speaking of action alerts, Deb, thanks for everything that you're saying tonight. It's really interesting. But what about bills that come up that are going to be against what we're trying to get done here? Like, I know there's, with all the things out there with voting and the partisan issues regarding voting and not trusting mail-in voting now and things of that nature, I'm sure there'll be a lot of bills that are coming up from Republicans, perhaps, that target taking rights away from people to vote.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a very, very reasonable worry. I think you're right 100% on that. And in terms of playing defense, we'll send out action alerts for those too. I definitely do expect some hostility to voting rights to come up. Over the last couple of years, they've been relatively quiet about that. But after the massive expansion of democracy, people are going to be more actively hostile to it. So.
But on the bright side, there's a larger public interest in voting at unusual times, not just voting on election day, on voting on a Saturday, on driving up and voting from your car. People, I hesitate to downplay the impact of the popular discussion. It's sad to think that much of what we're going to do is playing defense, like Dev said, opposing rather than supporting.
I think that part of the reason that Secretary Merrill was reluctant to really step out in front of some of the reasonable accommodations is that, well, it's pretty clear that there's no reason not to have these accommodations permanently. I think that knowing that people are going to say that, well, why can't we just do this all the time? It was part of the reason for slow playing it in the first place. And now we're here saying, well, why can't we just do this all the time? I mean, that's,
Yeah.
these are steps that we should be taking.
And we also have to keep in mind the cost element. This year, they got CARES Act money that supported some efforts in voter registration. So when we start talking about having more ambitious and plans, we need to also be clear about how we're going to pay for them, which is a whole other topic of discussion.
Yeah, to that point, I've actually been trying to find out how much our elections cost now. So I contacted the Secretary of State's office and said, how do I find out how much the election cost? And he said, I would have to call all 67 counties and ask them myself, because he doesn't know. And I thought that was crazy. So I called Madison County, I called Frank Barger's office, and talked to Shelby, and she said, well, we don't have all that information, and some comes from here and some comes from there. It's like they don't want us to know how much elections cost now. So when we say we want no excuse absentee voting and we say, well, that's going to cost us too much, or we want early voting, well, that's going to cost us too much. Well, what are you paying for it now? You don't know what you're paying for it now. So it's just very frustrating.
I'm scrolling through, thank you, Tara. I'm scrolling through the comments looking for questions. There's a number of comments in the chat, but not all are questions. One question that was asked was in terms of voting rights restoration, would we not consider complete universal suffrage rather than adding new felonies to the list that are disqualifying?
We threw that in there just to come. That was probably my smart ass influence. Because when we start talking about getting people who have committed felonies registered to vote, there is a big prejudice involved in whether they are worthy enough to vote. Our Secretary of State talks all the time about how voting is a privilege, not a right. So along those lines, if we're going to punish people who commit felonies by taking away their right to vote, let's punish everybody equally. That was the thinking behind that, as an argument to use. Well, if, you know, what I outlined in this is a very broad program of support. Like Dev, we're going to have to be practical once the legislative session gets underway to see what has a snowball's chance of passing. What can we get behind and support? I am thrilled beyond words that Alabama Arise has undertaken to work with us in this area so that we can pool our resources and we can have some success. But everything that I outlined is not always.
Well, it's possible, but that this time we might have lost Barbara more than just for a few seconds. What I would ask, if you have a question, as I said, there's lots in the chat box, but they're not all questions. Would you go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question?
This is Kathy. I had a question for Dev. I was wondering about the calls to action for the things that are, for example, I guess the gerrymandering, the redistricting is going to be included in your calls to action. But the Transparency Act, would you be doing, if there's legislation on that, could we as a partner with you suggest when a call to action needs to be made if you're not tracking that one as a priority at Alabama Rise?
Are you talking about the Open Records Act modifications?
Yes.
Yeah,
Oh yeah, yeah, absolutely. We supported that and we endorsed it, and we worked in a coalition on that one, and absolutely no reason to stop doing it now. It's a really necessary piece of legislation.
Okay, so that sounds like all 5 of our topics are covered under what would be a good, would fall under, if we could all agree on what was a call to action, then we would just pass that down to our members and to the community where we're coming from.
so ostensibly they'd get 2. They'd get one from Deb and one from us.
Okay, well then that's okay. So that's something we need to make sure people realize, that they're going to see it from us too, that we don't all pass it. We don't have to pass
Well,
it up
we can
through.
do it. We can do it either way. I just don't want anything to get lost in between.
Well, that's something when we talk amongst ourselves, we could probably figure out how we want to do it, because it may be good to do it both ways.
Yeah,
I mean,
just,
there might be. I mean, I guess it depends.
right. And that'll be the committee's decision as to how we're going to work together. I just want people to understand that we're working with Alabama Rise and we are thrilled.
Oh yeah, exactly. I was just trying to figure out, whether or not the things that weren't on their list, but it
Mhm.
sounds like everything we have is included in what they're tracking.
Right, right.
Deb, I had a question. The link you posted about the open meetings. Do all of them have access by either by YouTube or Zoom or something, or do only some of them?
I think that there's been a significant shortfall in actual access to public
Okay.
public meetings recently, and also the link I posted, the first one,
Mhm.
is not legislative committee meetings either. Those are on
Right.
those are on the Allison
Those
database.
No, I know. My understanding was the legislature has a plan to attempt to broadcast all of their committee meetings, and I don't know if that plan's come together yet or not, but okay.
I think they're a little farther behind than I would have thought they would be at this point on making.
Yeah, they've had months to plan.
Yeah.
Other
And if it's helpful for a letter from the league president about transparency and broadcasting meetings, I'm open to writing such a letter when the time is right.
Probably will be.
Yeah,
Probably
I think that could be
greatly
helpful. Are there other?
Tina?
Yes.
Is this myself, Nancy?
Yes, Nancy.
Thank you. It's kind of a mix of what a follow-up thought to what our new member, that is the Birmingham, I believe, a new member, Fronda Grant Jackson, who in an earlier chat commented on having seen a large long list in the St. Clair County, its title is St. Clair Times of
Mhm.
today, persons, I presume of St. Clair County, who are to be purged from the voter rolls. And I don't know that those lists are made in the larger counties with larger lists, but I don't know from what list St. Clair County would be finding those names. The slightly related is when I received My Jefferson County Board of Registrars postcard simply confirming, please tell us when you move, and these are your, State House, Senate, so on, districts and numbers and voting place, which is not a change for me, nor have I moved. But I had somewhere along the line, and it may have been, I don't know whether it was in a league meeting, as in Kathy Jones's presentation last month, or something that I had seen or heard the Secretary of State's, that there would be some kind of notification after the November election this year regarding something like the postcards, which there was a reference to in avoiding, I think, avoiding losing track of, being lost track of, because we may have, we may have moved, may have, and not gotten the postcard and or not followed up on it. Is there any relationship between those? I guess one question is this a notification just a reminder? And I don't imagine that it's based on, it doesn't say I voted, thankfully I did, but does anyone know whether this is required by all county voter registrars? And what's the status of whether the Secretary of State and or the county registrars will send out, those are from Secretary of State, I'm sure, the postcards, which some of our loyal members didn't get, even though they'd never moved.
Well, it's funny that you should bring that up. For everyone's personal edification and sometimes amusement, I would encourage everybody to sign up to receive the Secretary of State's press releases. Yesterday, I am on the list.
Really?
Yesterday, I received a press release that says the Secretary of State's office continues its commitment to maintaining accurate and up-to-date voter rolls. And he outlines the provision. The Voting Rights Act requires that they take dead people off the list, and that they make sure that there's a that there is a list. And I remember the league supported a computerized voter roll back in the day. So what happens is they send everybody a non-forwardable postcard in January. When the postcards are returned to the Secretary of State's office, they go, aha, somebody's moved. And they send you one that's forwardable. If you do not respond to the second postcard, then your name is on that list. And they're beginning now to publish every county in the state is required to publish in a newspaper of general circulation the list of all the voters that should be purged. So a newspaper of general circulation is generally the one that has the cheapest rates.
Hey, it sounds like this is related to that earlier press release where, is it January the 4th, that if you haven't voted in 4 years, or January 6th, that if you haven't voted in 4 years or your records are out of date, then they're going to purge. The
Right.
Newsletter said that they would purge people in that situation. And one of the things, there's an election commission report, and Alabama's got one of the highest purge rates in the country. That was something I'd like to look into, but not during the legislative cycle. But I think we really do need to study and understand why is it that we have so many people that get purged off the list every cycle.
Because we don't respond to the Postal Service mail very well. And this is a complicated issue. On the one hand, it's to our advantage to have an accurate list, so we know who is qualified to vote. But on the other hand, there are vast segments of the population. In my work with the school system, I can tell you half of the letters I mailed to parents about their children not coming to school came bouncing right back because people move around. And that's why automatic voter registration is so important, because it automatically updates the list without you having to do anything.
I do want to draw attention if people want to click on the link, and then we need to close up. But Julia Walden put a link in about a redistricting map that was done by children. Julia, do you want to unmute and simply say a little bit about that before we close for the evening?
Yeah, that was cool.
And Julia, I don't know if you're still on or not. But if not, y'all click on that link because it is really cool. Barring any other questions or comments, I'm going to go ahead and end this meeting. Let me turn it back over to Leonette in case she thought of any other announcements she needed to make. And we will see you hopefully on the 12th for our meeting that Joyce Lanning will be arranging on the environment and the climate. So Leonette, did you have anything else that you wanted to?
I just want to add my thanks to Barbara and Deb for sharing their insights with us tonight. This has been a great meeting to get us pivoted to the new year and the new legislative session. So thank you both very much. We will be following up, and thank you those of you who joined us from all over the state. It always makes our discussions better when we can listen in on what's happening in the rest of Alabama. So thank you all, and may you all have a healthy, safe holiday season and into the new year.
Thanks, everybody. Good night.
Well, thanks for having me.
Thank you, Dev and Barbara.
Thanks for making it easy.